Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to my July wrap-up. Today I'm going to be talking about all the books that I read in the month of July. So July for me is Jane Austen July, which is a readathon I host every year, along with Marissa from Blatantly Bookish and Claudia from Spencer's Library. I always have a really lovely time hosting Jane Austen July. It's always great fun, and I read a lot of good things this Jane Austen July. So I will go through what I read for Jane Austen July challenge by challenge, and then I also read one thing which wasn't for Jane Austen July, which I'll talk about at the end. Usually I begin my monthly wrap-up videos with a little goals check-in, but I'm not going to do that this time because I didn't read anything towards my main goals in July. I just read things related to Jane Austen, which was great fun. Also, before I get into the books, I will just quickly say that I'm going to take next week off BookTube and not post anything for a week. I will be back the week after, but I just feel like I have lots of stuff to catch up on. I think it's been a busy 2 months on BookTube between my 10 years on BookTube stuff and Jane Austen July, and there are some videos I want to make that I haven't had time to plan out properly, and I am really behind on replying to my comments and that kind of stuff, so I thought I would just have a week off posting and then I'll be back the week after. Also, I have lots of exciting stuff to plan for Victober, so you know, I'm very excited for Victober. Anyway, that's a whole another thing. Right, the things I read in Jane Austen July. The first challenge for Jane Austen July every year is to read one of Jane Austen's main 6 novels, and this year the book that I read was Emma, which was the group read, and I loved this, as I always do. Emma is a great novel. Really enjoy it. I think it's a fantastic book, really complex and nuanced and interesting, with a lot of fantastic characters, and every minor character is just fascinating, as is always the case with Jane Austen. Emma, if you don't know, is the story of Emma Woodhouse, who is handsome, clever and rich, 20 years old, and thinks that she understands the world around her and that she understands the people around her, and she kind of likes to matchmake people that she knows, but she's not interested in marriage herself. And over the course of the book we kind of see her begin to realise that maybe she doesn't know as much about the world and people as she thinks she does. And I love the love story. I love the character arc. I love the minor characters. Emma as the heroine is not my favourite Jane Austen heroine, but the minor characters in Emma are the best. I made a video all about Miss Bates, who is one of my favourite characters in all of Austen, so if you like that character, do give that video a watch. I'll leave it linked down below. Not a video to watch unless you have read Emma, as it is full of spoilers. I also do want to make a video about a subplot in Emma, which I have made lots of notes for and planned half of, and then I just ran out of time. I wrote 3 pages of notes on 2 bullet points, so I need to return to that properly and make it a manageable video. But anyway, I listened to this on audiobook. I listened to the audiobook narrated by Jenny Agutter, which I really enjoyed, and in general this was just a great read, as Jane Austen's books always are for me. Then the second challenge every year for Jane Austen July is to read something by Jane Austen that is not one of her main 6 novels, and for this I picked up some of her Juvenelia. This is a lovely little collection of Austen's couples' early romances, so it contains 4 pieces of her Juvenelia: Jack and Alice, Frederick and Elfrida, Edgar and Emma, and Henry and Eliza. I bought this edition in June and it's just really pretty, so I thought I would read that in July. I have read all of these stories several times before, but it's always nice to reread them. I really enjoy Jane Austen's Juvenelia and how silly and delightful it is. My favourite childhood story of hers is Jack and Alice, which I just love. It's so ridiculous, but it's fantastic. And actually it was really fun. Later on in the month I read The Female Coyote by Charlotte Lennox. I'll talk about that more later on in this video, but there were several things in that book that made me think of Jack and Alice. I think you can see how Jane Austen was influenced by these things. You know, in The Female Coyote, the main character is always saying to people, tell me your history, tell me your life story. And that's exactly what the characters do in Jack and Alice, and it's really ridiculous and really fun. I feel like it's interesting to look at the literary influences of Jane Austen's Juvenelia, because I feel like it's closer to the surface because she's still developing her own style, so you can really see where other authors have impacted her, which is really fun. Anyway, the next Jane Austen July challenge is to read a work of non-fiction about Jane Austen or her time, and I read 2 things for this, one of which was A Jane Austen Year, celebrating 250 years of Jane Austen. This is a book that was kind of produced by Chroton House, which is a museum. It's the house where Jane Austen used to live, and it's basically a coffee table book, I would say. So it's very beautiful, lots of really lovely images and photographs and illustrations, and you know, some sort of primary source documents and some photographs of sort of Chawton as it is now. And it basically goes through like the calendar year month by month and looks at either things that happened in Jane Austen's life in that month, or other historical events that took place in that month that might have affected her, or like bits that happen in her novels in that month. So there's quite a lot of extracts from her letters and quite a lot of extracts from her novels. I would say that this is a very, very beautiful book and a nice one to have. Like, it's a nice gift kind of book, and it's a nice coffee table book. I feel like I didn't get that much out of reading it all the way through, but I feel like that's because it is a coffee table book and it's kind of not meant for that kind of reading, if that makes sense. So an interesting read would be a nice gift for someone, but I wouldn't say this is one like you must go out and read necessarily. Whereas the other non-fiction book I read, I do kind of think you must go out and read because it was fantastic, and that is Jane Austen's Bookshelf by Rebecca Romney. This was so great, and I know a lot of people have been speaking about this book and it has had quite a lot of hype, but I feel like it deserves the hype because it's really, really great. I don't read that much non-fiction, and I don't always love reading non-fiction, but this is one of those non-fiction books where not only did I find it really interesting and learn a lot from it, but I also just had a really, really good reading experience. Like, I just really enjoyed the reading of this book. So Rebecca Romney works in antiquarian books. She's a rare book seller and collector, and this book is her examining the literary history of Jane Austen's time and looking at the women writers who came in the sort of decades before Jane Austen and why they have not remained in the canon in the way that Jane Austen has. So the book kind of consists of 9 chapters. So the first is about Jane Austen, and then there are 8 other authors she looks at: Frances Burney, Anne Radcliffe, Charlotte Lennox, Hannah More, Charlotte Smith, Elizabeth Inchbold, Hester Lynch Thrale Piozzi, and Maria Edgeworth. And basically what Rebecca Romney does is take each of these authors in turn, look at their life, their literary career, their literary legacy, and how that legacy has changed over time. Then she also looks at sort of usually one of their works in particular in a bit more detail, and then she also looks at like her own journey with this author, both in terms of reading their work and also in terms of finding a particular antiquarian edition of one of their books that she kind of added to her collection. So this book is, I would say, a kind of mix of biography, literary history, and memoir. It is not a work of literary criticism, and I do think that's worth knowing going in. I feel like I've spoken to a few people on the Discord server for Jane Austen July who weren't getting along with this because I think they were hoping for a literary criticism book, and that's not what this is. But I do think that what it is great, and I really, really enjoyed it so much. And I found the sort of biography and literary history and like literary legacy elements so fascinating. Like, I really loved how Rebecca Romney kind of looks at these authors and how their position in the canon changed over time, how many of these women were celebrated as writers in their day, but how they have fallen out of fashion since for various reasons. You know, one of the big reasons being that people don't think they're quite as good as Jane Austen, and that people seem to think there's only space for one woman from this point in time in the canon in the way that they would never think of with male authors. So I just found this book fascinating to read, but I also feel like it gave me a lot of really, really good recommendations for 18th century and early 19th century literature by women to read, because I have read some books from the 18th century, but I have never previously got on that well with the books I've read from the 18th century. And I feel like this book gave me some really fantastic recommendations, some of which I read later on in the month and loved, but also it's given me lots of recommendations to read going forward. In this book, Rebecca Romney writes about the fact that people often say or think that there are no good women novelists in the English language before Jane Austen. And I don't think I have ever thought or said that there are no good women novelists in the English language before Jane Austen, but I do think I have thought to myself that there are no good novelists in the English language before Jane Austen. But that's a really silly thing to think, because I haven't read that many 18th century novels, and maybe I've just been reading the wrong ones. And I feel like reading this book has really, really encouraged me to try some more 18th century literature, as indeed I did in Jane Austen July. More on that in a minute. But I feel like this book will hopefully encourage me to read more 18th century literature in the future as well. Like, I feel like I haven't been giving the 18th century novel a fair chance, so I want to do that. And yes, this was great. This will probably rank as one of my favourite non-fiction books I've ever read in terms of like the enjoyment of it and the impact it's had on me and will have, I hope, on my reading. The next challenge for Jane Austen July is to read a retelling of a Jane Austen work, or a work of historical fiction set in Jane Austen's time. So I mostly read retellings, but I did read one work of historical fiction set in Jane Austen's time, which was this, The Grand Sophie by Georgette Heyer, which I didn't really like that much. This was my historical fiction book club pick over on the Patreon book club I run, and It was really fun reading it with lots of people and discussing it with lots of people, but I don't think that this one was really for me. So this is a Regency romance novel from 1950. Georgette Heyer is often considered the kind of like founder of Regency romance, I suppose. And I had been meaning to read something by her for ages. And this book is about a young woman called Sophie who is sent by her father to stay with her aunt and uncle and her cousins. And she is not exactly what they're expecting, and she kind of bursts into their lives, interrupts everything, interferes with everything, has a very, very different, like much more strident personality to her family. There is a love story in here, although it wasn't as central as I thought it would be. A lot of the book is kind of about Sophie and her interfering with everyone's lives. And I think the main reason why I struggled with this book is that I just really didn't like Sophie. It was really interesting reading this book at the same time as I was reading Emma, because I feel like Sophie is very similar to Emma in lots of ways, but she's an Emma with no character development, who rather than being proved wrong is proved right, and the narrative seems to think it's absolutely fine for her to meddle in everyone's lives. I think I was meant to like her more than I did, and I feel like I would have had a very different reaction to the book if I had liked her as a character. I feel like Sophie, written in 1950, she's meant to be a character you like because she's independent and she breaks all the rules and etiquette of her time. But actually she's living at a time when etiquette and rules are hugely important, and so actually she does a lot of things that are really dangerous, and that are really dangerous for other people around her without any thought for the effect of her actions. And I found that very frustrating. So yeah, I kind of enjoyed the reading experience. Like, I enjoyed the dialogue and it was a quick read, but I feel like I wanted some more character development for Sophie and some more nuance in her character, and I didn't really like the ending for lots of reasons. I might try another Georgette Heyer in the future. I might see what my library has an audiobook. I know a few people have said that they like Georgette Heyer and this isn't one of their favourites, and I think because my issue with the book was that I didn't like the main character, and I think I was meant to, rather than that I didn't like the writing, you know, I think I will try something more by her. Anyway, I feel like I've gone on a tangent about the Grand Sophie, so I will stop what I'm saying there and move on to the next thing. One other thing I read for this challenge, which was just a little fun tiny thing, was this. This is the Meritan Gazette. So this was a present I got, and it's just like a pretend newspaper about, well, various Jane Austen characters. So, you know, you can see the front page is like Netherfield let at last, and then later on in the newspaper there are like references to other Jane Austen novels and stuff. This was really fun. I think it's a fun gift for someone especially. There were a couple of historical inaccuracies, and there's a mention of like Kitty Bennet being younger than Lydia, which she isn't, but that doesn't really matter because it's just a fun like Jane Austen in-joke really. And yeah, I had a good time reading this. I also listened to The Perils of Lady Katherine Deberg by Claudia Gray, which I really enjoyed. This is the third book in the Miss Tilney and Mr. Darcy mystery series, which follow lots of different Jane Austen characters from multiple Austen books and kind of bring them all together in the same world. We're following the daughter of some people from Northanger Abbey and the son of some people from Pride and Prejudice as they solve mysteries together. And in this, someone has been making attempts on the life of Lady Katherine de Bourgh, and she wants them to stop the would-be murderer before they get to her. And it's just really, really fun. I enjoy the series a lot. I don't always find the mysteries like super twisty, but I kind of don't mind that because what I'm really reading these books for is the characters, and I feel like Juliet Tilney and Jonathan Darcy are wonderful characters, and I love their friendship and the very, very slow progression of their friendship. It's just great and feels really, really believable, and so I will keep reading the series to kind of see what happens with them. And yeah, I just had a good time with this. Very, very good fun. And I especially loved the depiction of Lady Katherine in this book. I thought it was really, really good. Then I also read Emmett by L.C. Rosen, which is a YA queer retelling of Emma, following the character of Emmett, who is kind of getting towards the end of high school in the US, and we're following Emmett and his friendship group and his family, and the book kind of follows a pretty similar plot to Emma, although with slightly different pacing, I would say. Like, different things take up different space in the book. But I really enjoyed Emmett overall. I thought it was a good, fun retelling. And there were a few things I especially liked. I really liked the Mr. Woodhouse character, and I thought they did some really interesting things with Emmett's dad. Emmett's dad, like Mr. Woodhouse in Emma, has a lot of anxiety around health, but the kind of reasons for that are looked into really complexly in Emmett. And, you know, we kind of see that Emmett's dad really worries about his health and his son's health because he has a lot of sort of trauma left over from his wife's death. And I thought that that was just handled really, really well. I also really liked the sort of supporting cast and how various characters were interpreted into new characters in Emmett. I thought it worked really well. So really enjoyed that, would really recommend it. Then the final thing I read for this prompt, which was my favourite thing I read for this prompt and was just fantastic, was this Motherless Land by Nikki May. I really, really, really enjoyed this. I thought this was so good. So this is kind of a Mansfield Park retelling, but I feel like retelling is the wrong word. It is a book in conversation with Mansfield Park. So Mansfield Park, if you don't know, begins with a character called Fanny Price being sent away from her family home to live with her aunt and uncle and her cousins. Her aunt and uncle and cousins live in very different circumstances to her, and she kind of grows up sort of part of the family, sort of not part of the family. That's the kind of initial premise of Mansfield Park. And the initial premise of this Motherless Land is quite similar. We are following a character called Funke who has grown up in Nigeria. Her mother's British, her father's Nigerian. And after something tragic happens, she ends up being sent to England to live with her aunt and her cousins. So she moves to England and arrives in this new world, and she both is and isn't part of this family, and the way certain characters treat her isn't great. So you can see that the two books have sort of similar premises, but from that point onwards, Motherless Land goes in a very different direction. The plot is not like beat for beat with Mansfield Park. The plot has really nothing in common with Mansfield Park. But I would say that it is a thematic retelling in many ways, because the themes of this book are very similar to the themes of Mansfield Park. You know, one of the reasons why I love Mansfield Park is because of the way the book looks at home and belonging and kind of what it means to be part of a family or not to be part of a family. It looks a lot at place and what place can mean to you, and the importance of like trying to find a home. And also the relationship between Funke and her cousin Liv is very different from the relationship between Fanny and Edmund in Mansfield Park, but Liv regularly kind of lets Funke down in the way that Edmund sometimes does in Mansfield Park, and I found that really interesting. And there are other kind of similar characteristics and characters you can see. Liv's mother in this book is quite like Mrs. Norris from Mansfield Park, but like even worse. Like, she is awful and very horrible indeed. So this book is set kind of from the 1970s to the 1990s, I guess, but there are a few things about it that made me think of 19th century novels, because there are a few of those sort of like really exaggerated characters you get in 19th century novels, which I really love, and there are quite a lot of coincidences kind of in the plot structure, which again makes me think of 19th century literature, and I really kind of enjoyed all the different ways in which this book interacted with 19th century literature, while also looking really interestingly at late 20th century Britain and Nigeria. But anyway, I really loved how this book kind of engaged thematically with Mansfield Park, and I thought this book was thematically fascinating, as well as being a really, really powerful, impactful novel. There were some moments in this that I just found like so poignant and so emotionally impacting. And in general, I just had such a good reading experience with it, and I really, really loved it. I would highly recommend it. I'm very excited to go back and read Wahala, which is Nikki May's first book. And the final reading prompt for Jane Austen July is to read a book by a contemporary of Jane Austen. And I read 4 things for this prompt. I actually listened to all of them on audiobook. I was doing lots of redecorating in July and listened to lots of audiobooks while redecorating, which I really, really enjoyed. And I've definitely had a much better reading experience with this prompt than I usually do in July, and that is largely thanks to Rebecca Romney's Jane Austen's bookshelf, which guided my reading quite a lot. But also I think because of reading Jane Austen's bookshelf, I just like went into these books with a slightly different attitude. So I'll start off briefly talking about the one thing I read for this prompt, which I didn't really like, which was some selected poems by Hannah More. I kind of knew from Rebecca Romney's book that I wasn't going to hugely get on with Hannah More, and I listened to her poetry and I didn't. It wasn't really for me. It was very didactic. The general message was the poor should know their place, and I didn't feel that she had anything especially interesting to say or a very interesting way of saying it. So that's very harsh, but there we go. Hannah More was not for me. However, the other 3 things I read, the 3 novels I read for this prompt, I really, really enjoyed. So I read A Simple Story by Elizabeth Inchbald from 1791. So this book starts off with a young woman who, after her father's death, is sent to live with her new guardian, who was a good friend of her father's, but is quite a lot younger than her father was, and is quite strict about certain things, and his new ward doesn't seem to abide by his opinions about how you should live your life, and so there's lots of tension between them in lots of different ways, and everything kind of goes on from there. So that's the kind of first 2/3 of the book, and then in the final third of the book you skip like 17 years on. So I really enjoyed a lot of things about A Simple Story. I thought it was a really, really interesting novel in many ways. It's not a simple story, that is a lie. It is quite a complicated story, and the sort of 2 generations thing was quite interesting, and you see a lot of like interesting parallels between characters in the first generation and the second, and I thought the kind of like dramatic climax of both parts of the book were well done, and the characterization was really interesting and quite complex. In general, I just had a really good time with it, and I thought it was really, really interesting. Gave an interesting look into 18th century society. So I would really recommend A Simple Story. I think it's a very approachable 18th century novel, and there are some really interesting things about it. I also finally read The Mysteries of Udalfo by Anne Radcliffe, which I have been meaning to read for such a long time. So The Mysteries of Udalfo is a gothic novel following the character of Emily, who early on in the novel kind of loses both her parents and ends up kind of lacking protection. And this means that she ends up in various complicated situations, including a stay at 2 different separate gothic mysterious castles where things are going on that feel like they could be supernatural. And there's all the kind of stuff that you would kind of expect in a gothic novel. There's all the sort of whisperings and murmurs and rumors about hauntings, and there's lots of like little stories within stories, lots of dramatic secrets, and lots of the main character fainting, and I just had a good time with it. It's a really fun book. I will say that I don't think the pacing was perfect. As I said, there were 2 separate gothic mysterious houses, and I kind of felt like the book only needed one. There was a section after Emily leaves one gothic house when I really felt like the book was coming to an end, and then there was quite a lot of it left. But, you know, regardless of that, I still had a really good time with it. I think I probably would have found the pacing more of a trial if I had been reading it physically than listening to an audiobook, but I'm not sure. But I still think it was really fun, and I feel like the sort of gothic stuff was all just done quite well, and I really enjoyed it. And yeah, I would definitely recommend The Mysteries of Udalfo. Like I said, I think possibly one to listen to on audiobook. And then finally, I read The Female Coyote. I didn't actually read this physically. I listened to the audiobook again. I don't know why I really held up the paperback I got from the library. But anyway, I loved The Female Coyote. I thought it was so fun and so funny. So this book is from 1752. So it is from a little bit before Jane Austen. But we know that Jane Austen read it at least twice. And as I said, I think you can really see the impact of The Female Coyote in Jane Austen's Juvenelia. Anyway, The Female Coyote is so fun. So it is about a young woman called Arabella, Lady Arabella. She has grown up in relative solitude. She hasn't really seen much of society. She hasn't spent that much time with other people. And she has therefore like formed her ideas of life from reading a lot of old French chivalric romances, many of which focus on sort of ancient and or medieval things, and look at like heroes and heroines and lots of drama, and because her ideas about the world have been shaped by these books, therefore she expects her life to be like one of these books. She expects every man she meets to fall in love with her, and she expects every man who falls in love with her to have like dangerous designs on her. She expects no man to win her love before he has, you know, died for her. She has very strong ideas about heroism and how people should behave, and she is a very silly character in some ways, but she's also like very endearing, and she is also like at times very witty and very clever. And this book follows her life, her relationship with her father, and with a cousin who really wants to marry her but who she doesn't think is worthy of her because, you know, he hasn't died for her or killed anyone for her yet. We follow Lady Arabella in various circumstances, in her life in the countryside, in London, in Bath, and I just had such a great time with The Female Coyote. It is so funny and so sharp, but also like has a lot of really interesting social criticism within it. I listened to a really, really good audiobook of it, narrated by Donna Banya, which was a fantastic audiobook. Like, all the humour was done so well, but also the introduction, which was at the end of the audiobook, very sensibly, was fascinating and talked really interestingly about the ways in which The Female Coyote is quite subversive, and the ways in which the Female Coyote is more complicated than you might initially think. And I just really enjoyed the introduction and kind of really agreed a lot with what it said. And I just thought the Female Coyote was so fun. I had such a lovely time reading it. I just enjoyed it a lot. I laughed out loud and I really enjoyed the characters. I would say it is my favourite British novel I've read from pre-Jane Austen. I did also read Belinda by Maria Edgeworth last year, I think, and found that really, really interesting. And I would definitely recommend that. That's probably my second favourite pre-Jane Austen book I've read. But The Female Coyote would be my first. I thought it was so good. I really, really heartily recommend it. And especially that audiobook I thought was so well done. I feel like I've been filming for ages, but I will quickly talk through the final 2 challenges of Jane Austen July, which are not reading challenges, but watching challenges. So for the challenge to watch a direct screen adaptation of a Jane Austen book, I watched the 2020 Emma film, which I really, really enjoyed. I watched it alongside Marissa and Claudia, which was really, really fun, and we did a live show about it, so I'll leave that link down below if you want to hear our thoughts. I just think it's a great film and I really like it. It doesn't do everything perfectly because it doesn't have time to. I think especially some of the subplots aren't as well developed as I would like them to be, but I think for a film it does such a great job of capturing certain things about Emma, and I think there's a few things that it does really, really well. I just really, really love the Emma 2020 film. And then for the challenge to watch a modern screen adaptation or retelling of a Jane Austen book, I also went with an Emma one and rewatched Emma Approved, which is a YouTube mini-series from several years ago, which I just think is great. It's really, really fun and it adapts Emma into the modern world in such a fun way. It just really, really works. So I would highly recommend Emma Approved. I had a great time watching that. So there we go. That's what I read and watched for Jane Austen July, but I did read one book in July that wasn't anything to do with Jane Austen, so I thought I would save that for the end. And it was great, and that is The Housekeepers by Alex Hay. I've been meaning to read this for ages, and I read Alex's second book, The Queen of Fives, earlier this year and loved it. And I've been meaning to go back and read his first, and we did an author event together earlier on in July, so that kind of prompted me to pick up The Housekeepers. So this book is set in the Edwardian period, and follows a group of women who come together to perform a very elaborate heist. So Mrs. King has been let go from her position as housekeeper from a grand house shortly after the death of the master, and she decides that she wants her own back, and so she teams up with another woman who used to be a housekeeper at this house, and also with some other people she knows, some of whom kind of operate in the sort of criminal underworld. And together they decide to pull off this heist where they are going to steal basically all of the furniture and belongings from this house on the night of a ball, but without damaging the house so that nothing can be claimed on insurance. They're going to quietly strip the house of all its belongings. And we follow these characters from there. And it's so tense and gripping, and it's so thematically fascinating, and looks at this point in history in a really interesting way, and looks kind of at the darker side of late Victorian Edwardian life, which I really love. But it's also just massive fun. It's such a fun book, just as The Queen of Fives was. This book has such a spirit of fun to it, and it's just such a adventure of a book, but also, as I said, the themes and the kind of darker side is there and works really, really well, and I just loved it. So many fantastic characters, so many amazing moments. I just had such a wonderful time with this book, so I would really, really recommend Alex Hay. His novels are fantastic. So there we go. Those are the books that I read in July. Do let me know down in the comments, what did you read for Jane Austen July if you took part? And if not, what did you read in July? What did you enjoy? That's all for now. Thanks very much for watching. As I said, I am going to take next week off posting just because I have lots of other booktube stuff I need to get done. But I'll be back after that with another bookish video.